Koyaanisqatsi is a 1982 documentary directed by Godfrey Reggio. Also, I did notice in the Letterboxd credits, apparently executive produced by Francis Ford Coppola. But this is a documentary, sort of visual poem, I saw it described as well, which makes sense. Describing kind of humanity's advance beyond, away from nature. It begins kind of with its act one, kind of describing visually the sort of relationship of nature with its own elements. And then the rest of the film meditating on where humanity has gone away from nature. And in sort of good and bad ways, I think. This is a film that has no narration, no dialogue. This is carried by the visuals, the cinematography, the editing, and the soundtrack, notably by Philip Glass. So I think what might stick out to me the most is, it's just always interesting to see the way films work with self-imposed limitations. I mean, in this case, of course, we're talking about the lack of, traditional human characters talking, lack of dialogue. Limiting yourself to, you've still got sound and visuals at your disposal, but you're limiting the scope. You're limiting what you can do with them. So how does a movie like this still manage to establish itself, get its points across, tell a story? Because there is a progression, a story to tell that the film has. So the thing that stuck out to me the most is the progression of images in nature, the progression of images also in humanity. I think in nature it's strongest. The nature section I think is really concise, well constructed, and cohesive. We get these kind of parallels between a few different elements in nature. There's sort of a unity being described in the way these images flow together. And then there's also a really nice thesis statement to go along with that. What the movie starts out with is very simple. It's very efficient. It's a great thesis. We start out with cave paintings. That fades into shuttle launch. And underneath both of those is the titular theme, under which someone is chanting, Koyaanisqatsi. And I love that because that encapsulates the whole movie just right there. It tells you the progression because we literally do end with the shuttle. And then we, start with the cave paintings, which are, of course, on rocks, very simple, very tied to nature. Underneath it, of course, we have the title. The title translated, it seemed to have a few different potential meanings, but basically life out of balance, I think was the consensus definition. So we've got these few simple elements describing the title, describing what is to come, describing the difference between the two main elements that will be covered in the film. And it's wonderful. You know exactly what to expect just from those two simple visuals and the song. From there, we progress into some landscapes, some images, mostly of rocks and greenery at first. And there's a little bit of a theme of unity starting to show up with the rocks and the greenery. Initially we just get rocks, the grass and trees and whatnot come in a little bit after that, tying those two together. We also have something I love, the images of water and clouds. And what I specifically like about them, it's tying them together as kind of an idea of the water cycle, I suppose. But the way the film uses its time lapses, I think is really wonderful to give the clouds sort of like a flowing quality, like a stream. The very thing it's being paired with visually. It's cutting back and forth between the clouds rolling, the time lapse of that, as well as the waterfall, kind of creating little clouds of steam coming off of it, or water vapor or whatever. So I especially love how those two are tied together. And then after that, we get some images of, the camera kind of zooming across these lakes, seeing the combination of water and land meeting each other. We also get some smoke-related images. Some of them, the sand from the dunes. Of course, it's more dust, not actually smoke. But there's a clear visual tie between the sand coming off the dunes looking like smoke and the water vapor, the steam coming up from the caves and the smokiness of those have the same visual quality that the film is trying to tie together by pairing them. So I really like the cohesion and the way it ties those elements together as we're kind of getting an image or a series of images and a series of ideas about the beauty of nature by itself. And then it transitions so nicely visually from that unity of nature, the way these elements are paired together and so similar visually, with the introduction of the first human machine, which is that big, I guess I don't know what the name is. It seemed like a drilling machine. It was basically producing a bunch of black smoke. I think it was drilling for oil. Because, after the truck starts up, it spits out a bunch of black smoke that envelops it. And then the next thing we see is the camera kind of panning over to what I assume is an oil pipeline, going off into the distance. And I think what's noteworthy about that shot is that the oil pipeline creates like a visual divide, almost like an invisible wall between the two sides of nature, which we've established as being united, as being, paired together visually. This oil pipeline is breaking that unity that the film has already depicted. So, that section, up until we get, our first glimpses of human civilization, really, I think are so strong. It's so well conceived. When we get to the section with humanity, human society, humans' impact, and drift away from nature, it's not that I don't like it. It's just I don't think it comes together quite as cohesively or succinctly as the depictions of nature. That's not to say there's nothing good. There's a lot of beautiful stuff in it, and I kind of want to touch on that a little bit later. The beauty that can be found in cities and human structures. There's still a certain sense of progression, even though I don't think it's quite as clean. So to me, the highlight is like the first, I think it was 30 minutes or so, that's just nature. And the rest of it is still interesting. It's still easy to listen to. It's still, entrancing, all the visuals. But to me, the high point is the focus and the cohesion of nature. But when we move over to humanity, we kind of move off the oil pipeline. We see the, electrical grid, the wires and everything like that kind of interrupting the natural flow of nature that we've seen previously established. We start to get some images of, human structures like power plants, things like that, disrupting the natural skyline, the highways and overpasses, disrupting the flow of nature as well. Some man-made reservoirs, I believe. And, eventually it starts to focus a little more, generally getting tighter in focus, smaller scale. Though I think at times it kind of zooms out a little bit and resets our focus. If I'm remembering the order right, I guess it's possible I could have these backwards. But as I recall, there is a section where we're kind of looking at a city that's in disrepair, has a bunch of debris lying on the ground, garbage on the streets. And that is that happens chronologically before we get some far zoomed out images of the highway system at night. And, maybe it's not a big enough scope change to be offensive. I mean, it is still focusing on a city. But at the same time, it kind of feels like there are moments in the human society section where we're kind of like zooming in, coming back out, zooming in, coming back out a little bit. I guess I would have liked to see a more smooth journey into the granularity of human society. But I mean, to be fair, it's not like the nature section that I was a big fan of was always zooming in, zooming in. But it was also, structured a little differently, so I don't know. I guess I don't want to hold it against the film too much because it doesn't have to become more granular as the film goes on. I just would have liked it to be, I suppose. There's also a certain focus on destruction, with the whole sequence of buildings being demolished. There's a focus on, I mean, like I just mentioned earlier, the streets with garbage, the streets with debris. There's a lot of streets and highways being captured. The visuals of the neon lights at night and the street lights casting their bluish hue on the streets make for some really beautiful images, especially with those time lapses where it just looks like they're neon tube, kind of zooming across the landscape. Really beautiful stuff. And eventually we kind of get lower level to individual people living their daily lives. Maybe not individual people, that's not the right way to put it. Groups of people. Like at supermarkets, waiting for escalators, waiting for the train. And then we kind of go in a little bit further, focusing on manufacturing processes. So broadly speaking, again, we are the human society section is structured to get a little more focused as the film goes on. Slight variations in scope aside. So the point of that, I think, is showing just how at every level of human society we're kind of dependent on technology. Technology is in all of these things, be it large scale producing power, be it mid scale just getting places, or small scale producing goods and services that we need and rely on daily. So that's the sense of progression basically in this part of the film. It's showing levels of society, ways in which each of them depend on technology, ways in which each of them, are not the same flow, you could say, as nature. A large scale flow, like we're producing power, right? Like that's not natural to have generators, we'll say. That is something man made that we rely on. Mid level, the highways, of course, we have made travel significantly easier for ourselves with cars, with public transportation, highways, etc. Planes, there is a section where they're at an airport. And then, of course, at the small scale, using technology to make our lives easier, make manufacturing processes easier, right? Like we see workers who are just kind of side pieces to the manufacturing process, and the manufacturing machines are kind of doing the bulk of the work in a sense. Not that the workers aren't necessary or, whatever, but it's technologically focused, even at the scale of manufacturing things we need. So then the interesting thing to me is after that point, oh, I don't remember what the exact last scene is, but it's around the point where the camera's in the back seat of a car that's driving, and it's a great visual. Music is building to a big climax, and then soon after that, music basically cuts off, goes way down in intensity. The film slows down. We don't get any more of the fast time lapse shots. We get regular motion. We even get slow motion, and it's focused on people specifically. A lot of people watching. Sometimes, poverty. I think it's focusing on the one man who looks like he's in kind of rough shape. And so we go from this kind of shrinking scope of the progression of this view of society to kind of looking at the ills, the downsides. We get not only the homeless man, but also, I believe, a scene of like some kind of destruction of a town or some kind of emergency cleanup with the fire department, garbage in the streets again, kind of returning to some of those ideas from earlier. And then ending, of course, with the shuttle exploding, the title song under the credits again, or under the shuttle explosion. I'm not 100% sure how on board I am with that. Part of me thinks it would be best to go back to nature with some of the shots. It would be, I think, fitting with the title to be kind of illustrating some balance between, nature and technology, if that is the goal. On the other hand, perhaps the lack of nature at the end is saying we're too far gone. The technology is what it is. It's permeated our lives 100%. And, we just have to come to grips with the certain ills that has introduced for us and the problems that it hasn't fixed. To me, though, I think there's still a way to bring back the idea of balance, bring back the idea of nature at the end. I think if you juxtapose more nature images, or perhaps even the same images from earlier, with the ills of human society, that still gives you that same emotional beat of where we were then with where we are now. Because we have the technological complexity that is good for our lives. These improvements aren't mistakes. There are a lot of things shown in the film, which I'm very happy to have. Being able to have cheap manufacturing, easy travel, and things like that. are wonderful. So you have the benefit of that complexity compared against nature, but we also have to confront, the ills that we still face despite all this advancement. And I think contrasting the nature with the ills of society as presented would accomplish that pretty well. Then, of course, there's also the score. Variation in score, I think, is also pretty interesting. The score, of course, is generally very nice. It's enjoyable. There's a nice variation in dynamics between, most notably, the musical climax and the softness at the end of the film. But it also progresses nicely, even from the beginning, kind of a slower, downbeat start to really working towards that climax for the whole movie. There are never any huge jumps. There are some shifts in the way the music sounds. There are moments where it feels like a new piece starts. But at the same time, it's still consistent. It all feels roughly the same. It never feels like there's an abrupt jump between, humanity and nature. Like it's all a smooth progression. And then, of course, we have, some variation in feel, some variation in time signature, instrumentation. I really liked the moments in the second half of the movie where that extra bass would kick in to support like the synth lead and some of the strings. Love those little moments like that. There's a lot of good vocal work and things like that. So like I talked about with the visual variety, the time lapses, the fast camera movement, the slow camera movement, even the slow-mo sometimes, the regular motion. There's a similar amount of variety in the score. And those are important when you've got so few recognizable film elements to go off. You still need variation somehow. And even if you have fewer elements to do it with, this film still provides a good variety. That's basically everything I had in mind. It's a very interesting movie. I still kind of wish it was a little bit shorter. I don't know if that would help my opinions of the human society if it took less than 2/3 of the movie. I don't know that it all needs to be there. I just feel like it could be a little bit more efficient in that section of the film. But I mean, no complaints. I think very positively of it, and I respect a lot of what it's able to do with just score and visuals. It's impressive. It's a wonderful movie, well worth watching. So check it out if you haven't. Highly recommend.